Robert E. Lee, Gallant Christian Soldier, by Lee Brody. Chapter 1, Plantations and Poverty. A cry of a newborn baby drifted faintly from the plantation house known as Stratford Hall. A young slave outside the great house rubbed her hands against the cold. She cocked her head slightly, straining to hear. The sharp January wind made hearing impossible. A slave with her hair tied up in a red cloth opened the door a crack. "It's a boy." The young slave threw up her arms in joy. "A boy? Old Mr. Lee got himself another son." The house slave opened the heavy door a little wider. She motioned for the other woman to come closer. "Poor Mrs. Lee, she didn't want that child," Jessie said. Her red headcloth bounced up and down. "How do you know that?" "I know, that's how," Jessie said. "She already got 3 mouths to feed, and her husband is trying to stay out of a debtor's prison." Jessie's headcloth bobbed rapidly. The young woman raised a warning finger. "Don't you go talking that way. Mr. Lighthorse Harry Lee is a mighty fine gentleman. He was a Revolutionary War general that fought with Washington. 3 times Mr. Lee been governor of Virginia." "Makes no difference now," Jessie sniffed. "He lent a plenty money to Mr. Morris, and he didn't pay it back. Then Mr. Lee spent money for land, and he lost that too. Fact of the matter is, he's already lost everything he owns except this mansion, and he'd lose that if it wasn't his'n, but the creditors can't take it. The house belonged to the first Mrs. Lee, and she left it to their firstborn son, Henry." The young slave nodded slowly. "You're right about that, honey. Young Henry will inherit this whole place soon. From what I hear to tell," she turned. "I'll go spread the news it's a boy." Jessie closed the immense door. The slave glanced down the cold hallway, thinking about the fireplaces. All except one wing of the mansion was boarded up because there wasn't enough wood to keep the hearths warm. A quick sound of feet snapped her dark eyes up. A gray-haired slave hurried past, making little moaning sounds deep in her heavy throat. "What's the matter?" Jessie whispered, her hand on the headcloth. "She's dead." "Who's dead?" Jessie asked. "Who do you think?" She called over her broad shoulders. "Mrs. Lee, that's who." The younger slave swayed against the cold walls. "Poor Mr. Lee, widower again." She began to rock in grief. "Poor Mrs. Lee, I should have known it. Catching that heavy cold in December, riding in that open, cold carriage." The older slave hurried back, moving her heavy body with surprising ease. "Don't you stand around a moaning and groaning. Take this to the midwife and be quick about it, you hear?" Jessie took the clean clothes and moved fearfully toward the birth chamber. She fought back tears as she peered cautiously toward the heavy dark bed with the white canopy. "Where's Ruth?" the midwife snapped. "Why are you standing there staring? Get Ruth back in here." Jessie retreated uncertainly to where she could hail the heavy woman. "You better get back in there." The gray-haired slave heaved her bulk forward. "Why? What's the matter?" "Her eyes." "What about them?" "They're open," Jessie said. "Well, she's dead just the same." The older woman puffed past. "You don't know nothing about birthing and dying." "I saw her move," Jessie said weakly. But the older slave had not heard. The dark door closed slowly behind her. That cold January 19th, 1807, Robert Edward Lee had entered a family full of trouble. But there was pleasant news which soon swept through the slave quarters. His mother was not dead. She had simply lapsed into a coma after the birth of her dark-eyed, black-haired son. When she awoke, she named him after her 2 brothers. Slowly, Mrs. Lee regained her health, while her well-known husband vainly tried to pay off his creditors. It was hard on Light Horse Harry Lee, whose family were rich Virginia landowners. The Lees of Virginia were famous and honored back to their family in England, but that made no difference to the men who demanded that Henry Lee pay the money owed. The fact that Mrs. Lee was the heir of Virginia wealth also made no difference to the creditors. They wanted money now. Mrs. Lee tried not to think of what was going to happen if her husband couldn't find some way to satisfy his clamoring creditors. As she carried the baby about the great old mansion, she thought about what Stratford Hall had once been. It had been built as a fortress in the 1720s by a descendant of the first Lee to come from England. It sat well back from the Potomac, perhaps a mile. A view had been cut through the trees so that the river could be seen from the great house. In the way of mothers, Mrs. Lee patted her new son. She glanced around the once stately mansion. Our poor dwelling. She sighed. In a few months, Robert was toddling around the large sunny room with the big canopied bed where he'd been born. The room had very high ceilings and tall windows. Next to the bedchamber was his nursery. Long before Robert was old enough to understand, his older brother Sidney Smith Lee, age 5, showed him a cannonball. It was nearly covered with grass outside the kitchen. With all the excitement of having something important to share, Smith said, "Look, Robert, a British man-o'-war fired it from the river during the Revolution." Smith had little trouble pronouncing the war in which their father had become famous, but Robert didn't mind. He listened as Smith pointed. "The ship sailed right down the Potomac there and turned the big guns on our house." Robert shaded his dark eyes with a small hand to see the water. This was an early introduction to war for Robert. Another brother, Charles Carter Lee, 9 years older than Robert, told him the twin chimneys of their house had been used long ago by men for hiding places when defending Stratford Hall against Indians and other attackers. Robert's 7-year-old sister, Anne Clinic-Lee, delighted in babying her little brother. Robert's tongue pronounced his sister's name as Wanzi, and it struck as her special name. Wanzi's young ears had already picked up enough plantation gossip to know the Lees of Virginia were wealthy. There were many Lees, and nearly all of them were Virginia's high society. There were lawyers, politicians, and naval officers in the Lee cousins and uncles, but their branch of the family was now poor. Wanzi took Robert's small hand and helped him up their steep front stairs. One of the few remaining male slaves held the big front door open for the master's son and daughter. The slave showed a missing tooth as he grinned. Robert smiled back, his dark eyes flashing their gentle nature. The boy struck the heavy chains on the mansion door. He smiled at his sister and the slave, pleased with the rattling sound. The slave's face grew sober. Wanzi lowered her eyes. She was quite young, but she understood there was something disgraceful about having to chain the mansion door to keep out the creditors. As Robert grew, his love for exploring the stables grew also. "Up you go," said Mr. Lee, boosting young Robert to the back of a gentle mare. "Now just sit quietly until you get the feel of it. I'll lead the horse." A male slave grinned approvingly at the boy sitting calmly on the mare's back. "Young Mr. Roberts sits nice right. He'll ride good some day. Yes, sir." The 51-year-old father nodded. If he wasn't such a little toddler, I'd say he already had shown an eye for good horse flesh. Did you notice how he wanted to ride this one? From the first, Robert liked horses. His father taught him from the earliest possible age to appreciate good horses. This was natural for Light Horse Harry Lee, with his experience as a major general of cavalry under George Washington. Mr. Lee also taught Robert the values of moral courage and personal integrity. These were about all the creditors had not taken from Henry Lee. In 1809, when Robert was 2 years old, the creditors won. Gray-haired Henry Lee was thrown into the Westmoreland County Jail because he could not meet his creditors' demands. Young Robert didn't understand, of course. He only knew his mother looked sad much of the time. All the long time that her husband was away, Mrs. Lee said nothing of his absence except things would be better after his release from his present situation. She didn't say Robert's father was in jail, and the little boy wouldn't have understood. Robert missed his father, their walks to the smokehouse and around the formal garden, small stable and coach house. He missed his father's strong hands lifting him onto a horse. But in the father's absence, Robert grew close to his mother. "Would you look at that?" chuckled the heavy slave who had been in the bedchamber at Robert's birth. "For a woman who didn't want the child, she sure is mighty fond of him." "Can't blame her none," the male slave with the missing tooth observed. "Fine-looking boy he is. Quiet. Sober-like for such a little one. And he sure do love his mother." Anne Carter Lee, second wife of Lee, had been one of the richest heiresses in Virginia when she married the dashing ex-cavalry general. Her father had not approved of the widower who had come wooing Anne. Mr. Carter, owner of thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves at the mansion called Shirley, had thought his daughter could marry better. When Henry was thrown into the debtor's prison, it appeared his father-in-law was right. Yesterday's cavalry glories meant nothing. Mrs. Lee spent part of the time her husband was away in teaching her youngest son her own strong Christian faith. Bible in hand, she took the boy upon her lap. To teach him about the goodness and wisdom of God. And then easing off her lap, he knelt beside her to whisper his first prayers. While Henry Lee was in jail, his family waited uncertainly at Stratford Hall. Time was running out there for Mrs. Lee, her 3 sons and daughter. Her stepson had come of age. Henry could now claim the mansion, willed him by his late mother. Young Henry soon told his stepmother and her family they could stay as guests in the great home which he now owned. But Mr. Lee refused the offer in spring of 1810 when he was released from prison. "You'll like Alexandria," Henry Lee assured his wife, perhaps for the 10th time. "Many of your friends are there. A rented house won't be so bad. You'll see." Mrs. Lee's eyes showed their tiredness, but she smiled at her husband. "I'll be happy, dear. So will the children, all 4 of them." "Soon to be 5, he mused. "It'll be all right, dear. Now, let me get the packing supervised in Robert's nursery." Anne Carter Lee kissed her husband lightly on the cheek and moved off through the big mansion. 4-year-old Robert followed her. For a long moment his father gazed thoughtfully after dark-haired Robert. He was keenly aware of the growing attachment between mother and son. "Well," Henry Lee mused to himself, "she's certainly had enough problems. It's good for her to have someone so close to her." The master's pensive mood was caught by a young woman slave. "Poor old Mr. Lee. No money to tutor his young'uns. Having to live in his son's house. No wonder why there's moving." The heavy woman warned, "Don't you go talking like that. The Lees is quality. It'll turn out fine for them in Alexandria. You'll see." "I wonder. You see what Mr. Roberts got to take with him? A pony, a cart, and 1 family dog. That sure ain't much." Light Horse Harry Lee went to his wife. "I'll take Robert for a last look around," he said. He reached a strong hand out to his small son. Slowly they strolled past the great mansion and red sandy fields. They came to the smokehouse. Robert sniffed the pleasant fragrance of wood smoke which drifted from the small building. His father laughed. "You like that, do you, son? Well, so do I. Nothing smells much better than a smokehouse." "Kitchen," Robert said, pointing. His father laughed again. "You're right, Robert. The kitchen does smell better. Come on, let's go see if we can find some cornbread and fresh butter." The family moved to a small brick house on Cameron Street in Alexander. Less than 8,000 people lived there when Robert arrived with his parents, sister, and 2 brothers. One of the first things the family did was to attend the Episcopalian Christ Church. That's where General Washington worshipped. Light Horse Harry Lee said quietly, "That is where our family will worship too." Months slipped away and the general was restless. Twice he had been to prison for debt. During the second imprisonment in Spotsylvania prison, he wrote a book about his experiences in the Revolution. He hoped the revenue from the book sales would help pay his debts. Another ray of hope glimmered for Light Horse Harry Lee when his son Robert was 5 years old. The War of 1812 with England meant soldiers would again be needed. Although he was in poor health, the 56-year-old experienced general sought again to put in his country's uniform. "It'll be just as it was 30 years ago," he told his wife. "They'll need me, and I'll go, but there won't be General Washington to lead this time." Mrs. Lee patted Robert on the back. "You run out and play," she said. She fondly watched the boy as he bounced happily out of the room. Then Mrs. Lee looked lovingly at her husband. "You're a little older now, dear," she said gently. "They may not. They'll want me. I'm not too old. But if they don't send my orders through soon, I'll just cross the river and hurry them along. But I could use you more at home, Henry, since Catherine Mildred was born and Robert's still so young." Her husband waved an impatient hand. "If I don't get my orders by tomorrow, I'm going to Washington City." The next morning, Robert waved goodbye to his father as he left to find out why he had not been recalled to duty. It was a warm, humid July day when the aging soldiers rode away. Robert watched him with thoughtful eyes. Mrs. Lee took her son's hand. "Come, Robert, let's pray." A few days later, people began hurrying to the rented Lee house in Alexandria. "What's the matter?" Robert asked his mother. "Where's father?" Mrs. Lee knelt beside her son. She was still weak from the birth of her daughter, although months had passed. Many things were taking a toll of Mrs. Lee's strength. "There was a riot," she said. "Angry men tried to destroy a newspaper office. Your father aided the owner and was hurt, Robert." 1 man had died and 11 had been badly injured in the riot. Hot candle wax had been dripped onto Light Horse Harry Lee's unconscious form to see if he was still alive. One drunken rioter cut off the general's nose tip with a penknife. Little Robert E. Lee didn't know these details, but he knew something terrible had happened when important men began arriving at his home. Among them was President James Madison. The president spoke to the boy about barbarians and hypocrites who had seriously wounded Light Horse Harry Lee. Robert listened gravely as President Madison said, "Let your father's honor and matchless gallantry set an example that you will never forget." Soon there was more excitement. The British burned the nation's capital across the river. Robert could see the smoke from Alexandria. Everyone was very excited, for Washington was in flames. Weeks later, Mrs. Lee finished teaching Robert his lessons. He knelt at her knee, prayed as she had taught him. When he stood, his mother put her arms around his neck. Your father is going to take a trip, she explained. Maybe he'll feel better down in the warm Caribbean islands. Will you help me like a big boy while your father's away? Robert and his mother grew closer than ever before when Henry Lee left on a cruise to regain his health. Mrs. Lee had other children, but Robert was especially close to her. Mrs. Lee tutored Robert until he was old enough to attend school. She was deeply religious and taught her son to share her strong faith in God. The difficulties which she endured were not punishments from an angry Lord, as some whispered. Mrs. Lee knew that the Lord gave his children tests to help them grow strong. It was for their own good that the Lee family experienced their many problems. When Robert showed his strong will in his father's absence, an aunt offered suggestions to Mrs. Lee. Whip and pray, she said, and pray and whip. One evening, Robert sat thinking about his father. He missed him greatly. Mother, tell me stories about father again, he begged. Mrs. Lee told Robert that his father was a war hero who served under George Washington. It was your father who wrote General Washington's death. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, Robert's mother explained. Your father won important battles for Washington during the Revolution. The day came when Robert left home to begin his school years. The Carter family, from which his mother descended, was big enough to have their own school. Eastern View became Robert's first classroom. Robert was very close to his many wealthy cousins, both on the Lee and Carter side. Although Robert's branch had suffered great financial losses, the dignity and honor of the Southern family was stronger than the loss of money. When Robert finished school for the day, he hurried home to his mother. A visiting cousin, Edmund, watched Robert feed the pet rabbits and do the shopping. Robert explained in his soft Southern tones. Mother's developing such severe rheumatism she can't get around well anymore. Edmund nodded and offered a blade of grass to a twitching-nosed rabbit. Edmund didn't say anything to Robert about what he had heard. Anne Carter Lee was fast becoming an invalid. Robert's mother taught him to keep house. He did the chores without complaining, but he was also all boy and loved to roam through the hills and woods. He hunted ducks in King George's Meadow, a marshy area outside of town. Robert shot partridge in the woods and fished in the river. Sure, I know Robert, a neighborhood boy told a visitor to town. He's an expert oarsman and swimmer. He likes to swim in the Potomac, and nobody can beat him on horseback or afoot. One day a slave drove in from tobacco plantations with a wagon load of cured tobacco for the wharfs at Alexandria. He told the slaves who helped unload that he had seen Robert playing just outside town. Oh, could that boy run? I see him run a foot race up a hill and beat other boys mounted on horses. He run 2 miles faster than anyone else. Robert entered his teens as a dark-eyed, dark-haired, and very gentlemanly youth. He progressed to Alexandria Academy as his older brothers grew up and moved away. Carter, the oldest, earned a law degree from Harvard. Smith entered the Navy. Robert's older sister had an arm amputated in one of the continuing tragic events which seemed to plague Robert Lee's family. Catherine Mildred, born in 1811, was still at home when a shocking letter came from a friend. Robert remembered another letter that his father had written in February 1818. Henry Lee was anxious to return home, although he really wasn't well, even after all the years of seeking better health in warmer climates. He had written he was coming home, after finally finding passage on a ship bound for some southern port, not yet decided. Now Robert read the new letter which had come. He was on his way to Savannah, where he hoped to find a stage. a friend had written. When an illness befell him, he asked to be placed ashore on Cumberland Island. Robert stopped reading and glanced at his mother. She was dry-eyed, steeling herself for words which would cut deep into her. "That's an island off Georgia, near the Florida border." Mrs. Lee nodded and motioned for her son to continue reading. Robert cleared his throat. "Your husband had served with the General Nathaniel Greene in the Revolution. This island is his home, or was, until he died in 1786. Mrs. Lee made an impatient sound. She was now so badly crippled with rheumatism that she could not hold things in her hands without difficulty. "Just read it rapidly to yourself, please, Robert. Then tell me what the letter says." Robert nodded and quickly skimmed the letter. General Greene's daughter and her husband made father welcome while he was a guest in their home, but he seldom did anything but walk in the garden with their small son. 2 surgeons were sent by the Army and Navy, but it was too late by the time they learned father was on the island. Robert paused, looking carefully at his mother. Father was buried with full military honors in the Greenes' own family cemetery. Maybe we can go there sometime. When he was 16, Robert finished his formal education. But 1823 was the bleak year for Robert's future, for there was no money to go on to college. He and his mother had only the barest necessities. "There's one hope," he told his mother. "I've been thinking about applying for entrance to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point." His mother was silent a long time, thinking. As the son of a Revolutionary War hero and former governor of Virginia, Robert was certainly eligible for appointment as a cadet. Yes, he might just be admitted. Robert applied for entrance and on March 11, 1824, at 17, was appointed to the Military Academy by President James Monroe. It was the beginning of a historic military career for Robert E. Lee. That career was underlaid with a secret that gave him peace and a calmness that people noticed. End of chapter 1.